everybody. Welcome back to the Underwater Photography Show. As always, I am Matthew Sullivan.
And I'm Alex Mustard.
And today we are going over O-ring maintenance. I get asked it a lot. I'm sure Alex gets asked it 100-fold from me about.
I'm not sure about that because I'm not Mr. O-ring maintenance guy. So this is the area of underwater photography that I need to watch the video for, I think.
But anyway, it's a good discussion to have because there's lots of different opinions on it, and O-ring maintenance depends a lot on how frequently you dive, where you dive, the environment you're diving in. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today, and hopefully you guys can get a tip or two here and there about the proper way to maintain or improper way to maintain your O-rings.
Yeah, and I think if you use your common sense, you understand what the issues are, it will impact on how you do things. And I think dogmatically following a procedure because someone in a camera shop once told you to do that, and then you follow it for 30 years, is perhaps, for me, not the way to do it. It's about understanding the issues. And I think there are some interesting little parts to this that I think are worth discussing. I think the first thing I would point out is that the O-rings in our camera systems are not all the same. And we're talking now about the user accessible O-rings rather than the ones that are inside the controls and things, which tend to be only serviced at when the housings are serviced, if they are. In that there are three types that I'm aware of. And I'm not completely sure about the third one, which is the Nauticam one, but the classic O-ring is a rubber O-ring. These are typically black O-rings, and we use rubber O-ring grease on those. A lot of the more colourful O-rings you see are silicon-based O-rings, and these tend to be softer to the initial touch. And these are often blue or yellow, or depend. I mean, they basically can come in any colour you want, and the different housing manufacturers or different, particularly strobe companies, they tend to choose ones in the colours that they want their products to have. Like Inon have often used yellow ones, and I think CNC use blue ones, and that's about the limit of my colour knowledge on O-rings. I don't know about Marilux's green O-rings, whether they're silicon ones or they're a different material. And then the third type of O-ring that I'm aware of is Nauticam use these grey O-rings that seem to be different again. And I'm not sure what Nauticam make their O-rings on. I shall endeavour to find out, and if we do find out, I'll put it in the comments of this video. But the reason that it's important to understand that there are different types of O-rings is that the different type of O-rings need different type of grease. Rubber O-rings we typically grease with rubber O-ring grease, which is made of silicon, as far as I know. And that silicon grease, if you use it on the second type of O-ring, which are silicon O-rings, it causes those O-rings to swell. And when they swell, they don't fit the grooves that they're designed for so well, and they don't work. So it's important not to use the wrong grease, or to use the correct grease with the O-ring it's intended for. And Nauticam provide kind of much more. It feels like more of a lubricant than a grease. It's kind of a white, creamy stuff, which they provide for their grey O-rings. And those are the O-rings that I'm sort of familiar with. So the silicon grease tends to be, and then the non-silicon grease for the silicon O-rings both tends to be a semi-translucent, colourless grease. Yep. And then the Nauticam grease is a kind of a white grease. So that's the first thing I would add, and I'm stretching my O-ring limit here with that information. Do you concur with most of that, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I'm not the greatest with my O-rings either, and I am kind of if I have grease on me, whatever O-ring I have, that's the grease that's going on it. I know back in the day, especially CNC had a very specific type of grease that they were like, you have to use it only on CNC O-rings.
Yeah, so they were the first ones, I think, to introduce silicon O-rings.
Yeah.
So the silicon grease that was on all the other that you put on all the rubber O-rings at the time, that would cause the CNC O-rings to expand and not fit anymore. So that's why they were very, very careful about that. I do think if you use that CNC or Inon style grease on rubber O-rings, it's actually fine. So I think it was kind of fine to go that way. But if you use the black O-ring grease on those colourful O-rings, it's not so fine. It does, over time, it will cause them to expand.
That brings me to my next point, though, is one of the reasons I never really worried about it is because, and this will kind of transition us, It's because I don't lubricate or my O-rings or even change like take them out very frequently. So I'm not re-greasing them after every single dive or even after every single day. Often, if I'm diving here locally, I dive infrequently enough that every time I open the housing, I will change them or clean them and re-grease them. But if I'm on a trip, unless you're diving in a place like Lembe or Analao or something like that, where you're getting a ton of silt into that groove and sitting on the O-ring, in that case, I'll sometimes take a finger and clean it off and
Yeah.
then seal the housing back up.
I think I'm very similar to you, and I'm beginning to think that maybe the two of us doing this video isn't necessarily the best thing for the underwater photography community. So, in an attempt not to lead everyone astray
Yeah,
instantly,
yeah,
I'm going to start by saying that the way you should maintain your housing is the way that you feel comfortable doing.
yeah.
And if you change the way you maintain your housing and then have a problem, you will be even more annoyed than if you just had a problem carrying on the way you were. So if you are happy with the way you do things, please don't listen to the way we do things and necessarily change. But like Matt, O-rings don't leak because they're not greased. If O-rings are, supple, maneuverable, not dried out, they will seal very, very well. The grease itself does not help them seal. The grease simply keeps the O-rings in a nice, supple, working order. So I have to say that the most common grease I apply to my O-rings is rather disgustingly flipping my O-ring into my mouth and going psh, and putting it back in the camera. And I don't encourage that, especially in these post-COVID times. And certainly you shouldn't be doing it to each other's housings unless you've got the consent of the housing owner. But that's how I look after my O-rings. It gets rid of any bits of dirt in them. It boosts my immune system because, I think just like any child, you've got to keep eating some dirt all your life. Otherwise, you've got no immune system at all. I never get ill on trips. And I think that must be to do with the fact I'm always eating dirt from my O-ring. But jokes aside, I do clean my O-rings most of the time like that. I have to say, like Matt was saying, if I'm on a liveaboard trip, I might clean my O-ring when I put my housing together for the first dive. And then I probably am not going to bother with it. It just stays there. I don't take it out between each dive. I just open the housing, download my pictures, close the back of the housing again. I do check the O-ring to make sure it's not got, a big hair across it. But thankfully, being evolved for underwater photography, I'm not causing too many issues in that regards. If you have long, luxuriant hair, you might need to be a bit more careful about that than I am. If you've got a cat,
That sheds. Yeah.
cat that curls up on your housing all the time, in particular, that can be an issue. Generally, though, I have to say a hair on an O-ring might put some water in your housing, but it's very unlikely to kill your camera anyway. So a hair on an O-ring is usually the cause of a leak alarm going off, and you may be aborting a dive, but finding there's only like a teaspoonful of water in your housing. And the same with bad amounts of dirt, they'll cause the same issue. If I'm though not diving on a liveaboard and I'm doing shore diving with shore entries, or I'm diving, in a muck environment where there's a lot of silt around in the water, the camera's down in the sand a lot of the time. On those dives, I will take more care of my O-rings and I will look to see if the O-ring is collecting silt. And if I see a line of sand on it or any sort of sand build-up on it, I will take it out and clean it. Usually what I'll do is I'll take it out and I'll clean it with a piece of tissue paper. And then afterwards, I'll grease it to make sure that none of the fluff from the tissue paper is on there. But in all honesty, fluff from tissue paper is not going to make an O-ring leak. So you really don't have to be, too concerned about that. But I'll clean it off. I have to say though, ever since the advent of vacuum systems on housings, they definitely hold the housings more firmly closed, and I don't get anything like the sediment buildup that I used to get before vacuum systems. Before vacuum systems, I go to Lembe, after almost every dive there'd be that train of sediment along the bottom, and I'd be cleaning my O-ring after every dive. I think I cleaned my O-rings once on my last trip to Lembe. I did 49 dives, I think. And at some point in the middle, I took the main housing O-ring off and cleaned it. And I probably cleaned the O-ring once. And I probably cleaned the port O-rings probably a couple of times during the trip. Now, don't do as I do, but that's what I did. So, so similar to Matt, I don't think they leak because of that. There are a couple of other points I wanted to cover. One is just to make it clear that the grease does not help the seal. And in fact, if you put too much grease on an O-ring, you actually are creating maybe a surface that might help a leak. So just
Right.
be careful of that. There have been the odd product where over greasing can cause just, they're so tightly machined that over greasing can stop things fitting. And I know in one of the earlier generations of the retrostrobes, they actually started advising their photographers to grease the O-rings and then make sure they removed any excess grease so that it wasn't absorbed by the O-ring, because the O-rings were beginning to expand and they didn't fit as well when they began to expand. They've actually changed the design now, so that's not an issue, but in that generation it was. So that was a situation where greasing was actually causing potential issues. So, you know, don't think that you're doing your housing the biggest favor always by doing that greasing. And then just be aware that, you know, grease makes a big mess of other things in your housing. So don't put your finger on your lens or your port after greasing an O-ring, and things like that. But I think that's kind of for me, some of the main points I would say. I think I generally have no concerns opening and closing my housing. I don't feel that I know I've done enough diving to see housings that haven't been open for a couple of dives flood, and people go, oh yeah, if you don't touch it all day it won't flood. I've not seen really evidence that housings that haven't been left alone suddenly don't flood. Occasionally floods will happen for all sorts of reasons. The most common cause of a flood of a housing is someone not putting the housing together properly. And that's what causes the majority, and nearly every single catastrophic flood is caused by that rather than anything failing. And of course, the less you do that, potentially the less chance you've got. But you do see weird stuff happen. And, you know, people say, oh, vacuum systems, you know, I forgot that. I know if I've got that green light or I've got that measurement, it's fine. I have to say, on my last trip, it was very humid. You know, a couple of the vacuum systems went a bit wacky, and you know, one person in the middle of their dive, suddenly their vacuum system reset just because it was very humid and it caused a vacuum. So they were diving along, they had a nice green light. Then 5 minutes later, it was flashing blue at them, and they're like, "Oh my god, what's happened?" And I actually had a similar problem on my housing where it was very humid. I took I depressurized the housing, took the back off the housing. It was holding the back of the housing in my hand, and the green light was still on, as if it was still full of, you know, still full of vacuum. I put the housing in the air conditioning overnight, and it was fixed. But you know, it's yeah, it shows that, you know, you trust these things, but remember that, you know, vacuum systems there is to check you didn't do something stupidly wrong. But you know, I've definitely seen camera housings flood with the vacuum things still saying it's fine. And
Perhaps the most important O-ring key is
or,
put the O-ring back into the housing after you've taken it out. Uh,
yeah, yeah.
that's one of those stupid things, speaking from experience, that will lead to a housing flood. This was many, many moons ago, but it happened, and thankfully it was the last day of the trip. But if you're feeling your housing get significantly heavier over the course of a dive and you don't know why, it's probably because it's completely full of water because you didn't put the O-ring back in.
Another good reason to leave them alone.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. All the more reason to not touch them.
Yeah.
But hopefully, despite all the jokes, you guys got a little bit of something out of this, and something perhaps less is more when it comes to O-ring maintenance. But
One thing we didn't cover is how often do you replace them?
Oh, so I don't do a ton of diving, so I haven't been lately. If I'm doing a lot of diving, I usually have some spares here, and I'll usually change the main housing O-ring maybe once a year if I'm doing a lot of diving. If I'm not doing a ton of diving, I don't really see a need to necessarily do it unless unless the housing's been sitting on my shelf for 2 years unused. Then the O-ring might have given up the ghost. But I don't change them that frequently. Maybe I should. But
I never change them. Never.
Yeah,
No, same
I
one.
do it once a year. So
Yeah,
if Alex has never changed him, he's doing way more diving than me. So
yeah, but it's I have to say though, you know, I was shooting with Subar housings. I never changed the O-rings on those. I never had a spare O-ring even for a lot of the time, which I then thought was a really stupid idea, and I should always have a spare body O-ring just in case I accidentally cut it or I was greasing it and someone slips with a pair of scissors and cuts through it or something out of my control. I was like, oh yeah, I should have a spare one of those. And then I've been shooting with my current Nauticam housing for a year and a few months, and I've never changed any of the O-rings on that yet. But I will keep an eye on them, and if I feel they need a change, I will do. Because they're made of a different material, I don't know how long they'll last. But certainly the rubber O-rings just, are super hard wearing and super long lasting. So
Yeah, the one thing that I would say is if it starts feeling loose, and it like the thing that I do have a Subo housing here. I haven't used them forever, but one thing I noticed is when I put the O-ring back in, it takes some time to get it to all lay flat in the groove because it's gotten so loose now, so it starts to bulge up a little bit. At that point, it's probably best to change it.
yeah, that's a very good
Because
point.
you don't want to have to deal with putting it in that way every single time. And
You're
B, it's
greasing it
probably
too much.
reached the end of its lifespan. So probably a good time to change if your O-rings are starting to do that. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's
And examine them. Obviously, any sign of a small nick, anything like that, change them straight away. Occasionally they will pick up something like that. Usually, you're putting the camera in the back and you maybe drop it or something, and a sharp edge on the tray or something catches the O-ring and it can put a nick in it. And in that situation, that's why you'd want a spare. You don't really need spare port O-rings because all your ports take the same size O-ring, so you can always borrow one off another port on a trip. But a camera body O-ring is a good thing to have. But yeah, I don't change mine, and it's never, and I don't find it makes a difference. And to put that to an extreme test, I've got a very old Hasselblad housing from the 70s, and it's got a main body O-ring. And when I got that housing, and I'll tell the story about how I got it at the time, the O-ring was absolutely like rock solid. It was not rubber, it was solid plastic. And I put a lot of O-ring grease in it trying to loosen it up. And it did get a little bit more pliable. But I just assumed that I'd never be able to find an O-ring that fitted. So I never looked for an O-ring, which is a bit stupid because O-rings are pretty standard things and they're easy to find. They don't have to be underwater photography O-rings to work perfectly well. And I kind of regret I should have done that. But I carried on using this original O-ring and it never leaked. And that was as hard a ruined old O-ring as possible. And, it was still super robust. If you do need to measure to get a new O-ring, O-rings have 3 measurements. They have an external, it's too long since I've ordered O-rings. I think they have an external circumference, or it could be diameter.
Diameter to
external circumference or diameter, and then a thickness. So all O-rings are specified in 3 measurements. And with a pair of calipers, it's pretty easy to figure out what you want. I've many times ordered O-rings for the O-rings that you get on strobe arms and things like that. If you want particular colourful ones, in the past I've ordered all sorts of colours in that. I think they're 23, 25, 3mm O-rings or something. It's something like that. So that suggests to me that it's diameters, not circumferences, that they're measuring. But anyway, if you do have a weird O-ring that you can't find a replacement for, be aware that the whole world runs on O-rings and you can find them online and order them, and they are ridiculously cheap. O-ring specialist shops, have them online. They have huge inventories, and you'll be like, oh my God, I can't believe it's only, $1. And for that $1, you get 30, it's crazy. Right. That's about it for me on O-rings. It's exhausted everything I know about them for sure.
All right. Well, thank you guys for watching this one. Hopefully you stuck through the whole thing, and we will see you in the next one.